Billions were being offered and none of it was heading to the WTA. Brands weren't simply pursuing Eala. They were forsaking the entire tour. A 19-year-old from the Philippines had become more financially useful than a professional circuit created over 5 decades. Not through Grand Slam domination, not through ranking dominance, via something far greater hazardous to the establishment. Pure uncontrolled cultural magnetism. And when the financial numbers started surfacing, the tennis world didn't just raise eyebrows. It held its breath. Because what was occurring wasn't a sponsoring tale. It was a power shift. A modest corporate revolution disguised in a tennis skirt. And the WTA, they never noticed it approaching. Stay locked in because by the end of this, you'll understand why the most crucial struggle in women's tennis right now isn't occurring on any court. There's a certain type of athlete that surpasses their sport before the sport properly acknowledges them. Muhammad Ali did it. Serena Williams did it. And now, if the WTA institution welcomes it or not, Alexandra Eala is doing it on a scale it features corporate boardrooms from Manila to Manhattan, entirely revamping their marketing blueprints. Born in the Philippines, raised on severe discipline and created by the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca, Eala carried something into professional tennis that no coaching guidebook teaches. She carried a narrative, a real cross-continental, multi-generational narrative that resonated with billions of people throughout Southeast Asia, Europe, and the Americas simultaneously. That mixture, the underdog geography, the elite European training ground, the infectious personality, created what marketing executives secretly describe as a great cultural convergence. And companies noticed long before the rankings caught up. By the moment Eala was breaking through on the WTA tour, her social media following had already exceeded many of higher-ranked players. Her Instagram engagement rates weren't merely great for a tennis player. They were strong for any athlete in any discipline wherever on the globe. Brands measuring true audience connection, not merely following counts, but actual emotional investment from genuine communities. We're viewing statistics that made their analysts double-check the info. Sports ear businesses, luxury watch producers, technological titans, telecoms businesses with huge Southeast Asian consumer bases. They weren't simply interested. They were competing aggressively. Behind closed doors, talks were rising from exploratory conversations into serious financial commitments. And significantly, these chats weren't flowing through WTA partnering channels. They were going right to Eala's representation. This difference important enormously. The WTA works on a conventional sports marketing infrastructure. Centralized sponsorships, official tour partnerships, revenue structures created around the communal. That model functioned great for decades, yet it was built for another period. An period before a single athlete may command more digital attention than the whole company promoting her. Eala represented anything the old model hadn't accounted for. A player whose individual brand gravity was pulling sponsors out of the tour's orbit altogether. Not via disagreement, not through conflict, merely via existing and interacting with audiences on a frequency that WTA's institutional voice couldn't match. Inside tennis circles, murmurs were multiplying. Agents representing other players started hearing from brand partners that budget allocations were being reviewed. Tournament sponsors began obtaining quieter reactions to rejuvenation suggestions. The money wasn't disappearing from women's tennis. It was focusing, moving toward one unique center of cultural gravity. And that point had a name. That point had a backhand that may interrupt discussions. And that point was just getting begun. Ask yourself this. When was the last time a teenager made billion-dollar firms radically rethink their whole sports marketing strategy? Because that time, it had already arrived. Numbers have a way of escaping rooms. They were never supposed to depart. The statistics being discussed in private talks surrounding Alexandria's individual sponsorship portfolio weren't small endorsement deals. These weren't the usual mid-tier layouts that professional tennis players outside the top 10 often secure. What was circulated in private term sheets in preliminary agreements reflected a kind of financial commitment that placed a player still ascending the rankings, in commercial negotiations normally reserved for established Grand Slam champions. Reports emanating from sports business circles indicated each brand offers approaching statistics that aggregated over many alliances established a whole portfolio value estimated not in millions but in the billions when projected over multi-year commitments. A telecoms behemoth with huge Southeast Asian market penetration was reportedly among the leading runners. Several sportswear businesses interpreting the cultural imprint Eala controlled across a large and increasing customer demographic entered important conversations. Technology brands finding true ambassador voices in developing markets saw her as irreplaceable. What made these offers special wasn't merely the scale, it was the structure. Brands weren't approaching Eala's team wondering how she fit within existing WTA neighboring partnership frameworks. They were constructing totally bespoke setups, imaginative partnerships, ownership holdings, and sponsored content projects, long-term ambassador architectures that treated her as a media entity rather than merely an athlete endorser. One sports marketing analyst speaking to industry articles described the scenario with stunning directness. Brands had fundamentally decided that the audience emotional connection Eala established was more effectively accessible by going surrounding the tour than through it. The WTA's official partnership infrastructure, although valuable for reaching large tennis audiences, couldn't give the exact, deeply faithful, culturally distinctive communities that followed Eala personally. For the WTA, this fact carried severe financial implications. When companies redirect sponsorship capital away from organizational partnerships toward individual athlete deals beyond tour buildings, the collective loses leverage. Other players lose visibility. Smaller competitions lose financial streams. The entire ecosystem feels the burden. And here's the dimension that genuinely intensified the tension. Eala wasn't engineering this circumstance. She wasn't placing herself adversarially against any institution. Her representation was merely responding to exceptional market demand with proper commercial approach. That's not revolt. That's business. But the penalties for the WTA were equal regardless of purpose. Behind closed doorways, tour executives were having unpleasant chats. How does an organization keep sponsorship significance when one of its own members has become a more appealing individual investment than the communal platform? How do you reorganize commercial frameworks created for a pre-social media landscape to accommodate an athlete whose personal audience dwarfs institutional reach? These weren't hypothetical strategic questions anymore. They required immediate answers. And the WTA, for reasons that will eventually become extremely public, appeared to be seeking for the answers much too slowly. The billion-dollar question wasn't if Eala merited these offers. Nobody genuinely challenged that. The question ripping through tennis boardrooms was considerably more unsettling. Had the WTA already lost the commercial narrative? And if so, could they ever truly recover it? Silence at moments of systemic crisis is never truly silent. It communicates everything. While brand negotiations surrounding Eala were intensifying and sports business media was beginning to link dots officially, the WTA's official communication routes remained conspicuously silent. No formal acknowledgement, no strategic positioning statement, no obvious effort to redefine the commercial discussion on their terms, merely institutional stillness at just the moment decisive action was most necessary. And that silence was devastating. In the current media world, an organization's incapacity to regulate its own tail doesn't merely build a vacuum. It hands the microphone to everyone else. Tennis journalists, sports marketing analysts, fan communities throughout various continents, and rival sports entities all rushed to fill the interpretative void the WTA left unfilled. The tale being developed in their absence wasn't flattering. It depicted a ruling body captured entirely unprepared by a transition that glancing backward had been seen for years. The inherent structural causes for this delayed reaction were complicated. The WTA works over numerous jurisdictions, balancing competing interests from players, competitions, broadcasters, and established corporate partners concurrently. Decision-making inside that framework moves deliberately. In typical circumstances, because deliberateness demonstrates responsibility governance. But conditions surrounding Eala's commercial boom were anything from usual. Speed was essential. Adaptation was crucial, and speed wasn't arriving. Meanwhile, individual sponsors growing wary of the WTA's strategic orientation began probing talks that months earlier would have been inconceivable. Brands that had maintained stable, mutually beneficial tour partnerships after years were suddenly asking basic problems concerning return on investment. Were WTA-adjacent positions still reaching the audiences brands required most? Or had those audiences migrated following specific athletes, unique experiences, distinct cultural moments apart from institutional channels entirely? The replies those brands were receiving internally were deeply uncomfortable for tour leadership. Digital analytics don't negotiate. Audience migration data doesn't respect historic relationships, and the overwhelming conclusion for many independent commercial assessments was consistent. The WTA's capacity to deliver some high-value audience groups have considerably weakened. While Eala's separate platforms had simultaneously today, players throughout the tour starting noticing the downstream impacts. Conversations with prospective personal sponsors were moving. Brand representatives who previously mentioned WTA partnership alignment as a positive signal were now mentioning it less frequently or framing it with qualifications that hadn't appeared before. The institutional endorsement that once amplified individual player commercial value was losing some of its gravitational pull. Veteran players speaking anonymously to sports journalists expressed genuine frustration. They had invested careers building the WTA's collective commercial reputation. The idea that institutional silence during a pivotal transition moment was potentially undoing years of collective effort felt to many like a profound failure of leadership. And still officially nothing. The WTA's communication vacuum wasn't simply a public relations misstep. It was a signal to every corporate partner currently evaluating their relationship with women's tennis that the organization lacked either the awareness or the decisiveness to navigate its own transformation. For sponsors accustomed to partnering with forward-thinking, strategically articulate organizations, that signal carried serious weight. Every day of institutional quiet cost something real, and the invoice was accumulating rapidly. When corporations begin quietly restructuring financial commitments, the word they use is never withdrawal. The language is always softer. Strategic reallocation, portfolio reassessment, shifting investment priorities. But beneath the careful corporate vocabulary, the meaning is identical. The money is moving. And in women's tennis, it started moving with alarming velocity. The departures didn't announce themselves dramatically. That's never how institutional sponsorship erosion operates. It happens through renewal conversations that don't reach conclusions, through option clauses that expire without activation, through partnership agreements that simply aren't extended with the enthusiasm or at the financial levels they previously commanded. Gradually, then suddenly, the commercial foundation began showing fractures. Multiple brands with established WTA presence began redirecting meaningful portions of their sports marketing budgets toward individual athlete partnerships outside tour structures. The calculus driving these decisions was straightforward and, from a purely commercial perspective, entirely rational. Audience engagement metrics around specific players, Eala being the most dramatic example, but not the only one, consistently outperformed tour-eyed placement data. For brands optimizing every marketing dollar against measurable audience response, the conclusion wasn't complicated. The tournament ecology sensed this immediately. Smaller WTA tournaments, which depend heavily on sponsorship revenue compared to broadcast income, began operating under tighter financial constraints. Prize fund discussions become very complex. The operational infrastructure sustaining hundreds of players across the professional circuit, the athletes who would never command individual billion-dollar portfolios, but who created the competitive backbone making top tennis possible, started experiencing true strain. This dimension of the fallout seldom garnered considerable publicity. The headline storyline focused on Eala's tremendous commercial ascension. The calmer, more significant narrative was what her gravitational commercial pull was costing the athletes who would never gain from it directly. A mid-ranked player participating in the second division of WTA tournaments doesn't get anything from Eala's sponsorship discussions, but she loses anything if those talks shift funding away from the communal infrastructure sustaining her career. Several significant voices within the tennis community began addressing this point publicly. The conversation wasn't framed antagonistically toward Eala personally. Virtually everyone acknowledged the circumstance wasn't her invention or her responsibility. The dissatisfaction was focused at structural shortcomings within the sports advertisement architecture and at organizational leadership seen as insufficiently equipped to adapt. Sports economists evaluating the situation observed a concerning parallel with dynamics that had already destabilized other professional sports leagues. When individual athlete commercial worth massively outpaces institutional brand equity, revenue distribution within the sport becomes essentially imbalanced. The sportsmen with enormous individual profiles capture immense value. Everyone else faces escalating economic uncertainty. The middle of the competitive field, which is crucial for any sport's long-term health, becomes financially insecure. For the WTA, controlling this dynamic needed immediate, clever structural innovation. The organization needed commercial frameworks capable of acknowledging and accommodating exceptional individual athlete value while keeping significant collaborative revenue streams. Whether that capacity existed inside present leadership was a question the sponsorship exodus was answering loudly. The corporate departures were never truly about Eala. They were a verdict on whether the WTA has evolved swiftly enough to stay commercially essential amid a changing media world. And that conclusion at this specific moment was sharp and clear. The court has rendered its judgment. Now all eyes directed toward one specific interview, and what occurred next genuinely nobody predicted. There are times in sports when an athlete says something so precise, so surprisingly honest that it rips through every layer of institutional narrative and lands immediately in the public awareness like a brilliantly hit winner down the line. Alex Eala gave just that moment. And the internet didn't only respond, it detonated. In an interview it disseminated across channels using remarkable quickness. Eala addressed the business circumstance around her career with a directness that caught nearly every onlooker off guard. She wasn't unfriendly. She wasn't performing grievance or manufacturing dispute. Her tone was measured, thoughtful, and constructed in a way that somehow made her words sting more than any emotional outburst might have. She spoke about signifying something bigger than individual achievement, about recognizing that her visibility carried obligation toward the communities, Filipino, Southeast Asian, young ladies internationally, who viewed themselves reflected on her trip regarding exploring commercial potential in methods that recognized that duty while simultaneously claiming that her value, her real cultural currency, deserving acknowledgement on conditions that truly mirrored reality. And then she said anything that stopped the entire conversation chilly. She acknowledged without bitterness, but with absolute clear that the structures around professional women's tennis hadn't been created with athletes like her in mind. Athletes whose commercial popularity derived principally from cross-cultural resonance rather than sheer ranking performance. Athletes whose audience relationships existed irrespective of institutional frameworks. Athletes who by merely existing truly challenged assumptions about how value gets measured and distributed in professional sports. Those words traveled everywhere simultaneously. Sports media magnified them within hours. Marketing industry publications investigated them with real fascination. Fan communities spanning Southeast Asia burst with furious pride and emotional appreciation. Tennis fans worldwide involved in huge disputes regarding structural fairness, commercial equity, and institutional accountability. It created millions of encounters on every major platform. What made the moment so powerful wasn't its confrontational quality. It was the deep reasonableness of what Eala was expressing. Nobody listening could regard her perspective as naive or self-serving. The structural observations she stated were truthful, verified, and reflected fears that players, analysts, and sports economists had been talking secretly for years. Having a 19-year-old at the center of the storm explain them with such quiet accuracy was absolutely astounding. The WTA's response to this interview was characteristically delayed. When formal statements eventually appeared, they read as defensive rather than reflective. Measured observers noted that a really confident organization would have engaged Eala's views with intellectual seriousness rather than institutional deflection. The contrast between her calmness and the organization's odd placement only increased popular sympathy in her direction. Social media fan communities, notably around the Philippines and wider Southeast Asia, changed the event into a cultural landmark. Clips from the interview collected hundreds of millions of views. The hashtags around her name dominated trendy talks across many platforms for consecutive days. International media sources that seldom covered women's tennis were suddenly running noteworthy feature stories. And through all of it, IA remained composed, courteous, concentrated on tennis while the commercial and institutional world whirled around her. That composure, perhaps more than any specific statement, conveyed something deep about her character and made her much more desirable to the brands is chasing her with tremendous financial commitment. One question was now surging through every discussion regarding women's tennis. Was this a momentary turbulence or had something permanently shifted? Alex Eala didn't ignite a conflict with the WTA. She merely became too enormous for the present structure to comfortably grasp. Brands followed genuine value. Audiences followed true connection. And an institution established for a bygone period finding itself economically overtaken by a teenager carrying an entire nation's sporting goals on her shoulders. The numbers don't lie. The leaving sponsors don't negotiate emotion. Something fundamental shifted here. And women's tennis will never look identical again. If this tale actually moved you, hit subscribe because the largest chapters in women's tennis are being written right now and you don't want to miss a single word.